Welcome to News Channel. Dear friends, on February 24, 2013, President Vladimir Putin of Russia ordered a special military operation in Ukraine. This is a move that shocked the world, lasting more than a year. But the roots of the conflict are deep in the history of tensions between Russia and the West, which have been simmering for many years. This conflict is not only the result of direct conflicts between these countries but also the product of complex strategic calculations between Russia, the United States and Western countries. Through this video, we will explore the nature of this war and the strategies that the parties involved have implemented. German newspaper DJ's interview on December 7, 2022 with former German Chancellor Angela Merkel revealed an important detail. In the interview, Merkel admitted that the 2014 Minsk agreements were an attempt to give Ukraine more time to become stronger. Just a few days later, former French President François Hollande, who was also a co-sponsor of the agreement, in negotiations with Russia, agreed with this view in an interview with Sydependent newspaper. Asked whether the Minsk agreements were aimed at slowing Russia's advance in Ukraine, Mr. Hollande replied, "Yes, Angela Merkel was right." The reaction from the Russian side is quite understandable when the Russian media immediately quoted these two opinions to confirm their long-standing position that from 2014 to February 2022, all Western actions in negotiations and signings only served to buy time for Ukraine, which is on the brink of collapse after a major siege by Russian troops in Debaltsevo and prepares for a future war with Russia. However, the reaction from Russian President Putin was much calmer. He only commented that he was disappointed by the West's attitude in signing and implementing the two Minsk agreements. The story revolves around mysteries and never-before-revealed truths during the negotiations and signing of the Minsk agreement, leading us into a complex international strategic maze. First, the question is whether the Russians know that the West's negotiation and signing of the Minsk agreements is just a ploy to buy time for Ukraine to strengthen its military capabilities. Preparing for a war with Russia in the future? The answer is yes. Even during the negotiations, Russian intelligence deeply penetrated all levels of Ukrainian society and government. The number of people in Ukraine's law enforcement and armed forces who sympathize with Russia is also very large. Therefore, the West's aggressive rearmament of the Ukrainian army as well as covert activities to sabotage the implementation of the Minsk I and II agreements cannot escape the Russians. Second, is Russia prepared for a war in Ukraine? And if so, when did it start? Russia's reactions and activities show that they have been carefully preparing for this situation for a long time, including building and strengthening military forces in strategic areas, as well as planning operations. Detail.
Third, why did Merkel and Hollande say these things in December 2022? After 5 years of keeping it secret? Maybe they realized that the truth needed to be published to clarify the purpose and consequences of the Minsk agreements, or maybe this was a move to influence public opinion and international politics at a time when they are.
Finally, where will the Russians go in this war and what will happen in the near future? This is a difficult question to answer accurately, but it is certain that the war will continue to deeply affect regional and global politics. The whole world is closely watching every step of Russia and the reaction of the international community to predict the future of a volatile region. In the complex context of current international relations, the West's attempt to purge Russia's influence on the Ukrainian government apparatus has not been able to prevent Russia's deep penetration. By the time the war broke out, between 2 and 6 members of Ukraine's negotiating team with Russia had been removed from their positions for treason, reflecting the serious level of infiltration by Russian intelligence. In the Zaporozhye region, nearly 50 employees of the Ukrainian Security Forces, SBU, stayed in the Russian-occupied area and cooperated with them. As a result, a series of purges took place against the leadership of the SBO in eastern Ukraine. In addition, the arrest of senior officials of Motorsyk Group, the company that produces engines for fighter jets and helicopters of the Ukrainian army, took place because they supplied these engines to Russia for the past 8 years. Russia's deep understanding of Western intentions lies not only in its intelligence from agents who infiltrated Ukraine's systems, but also in its ability to clearly identify rearmament plans. Prepare the army and prepare for war. This not only concerns the military sector but also every aspect of society, from educating the young generation, eliminating Russian culture, changing laws and policies, especially in the southeast region. And finally, the incessant fighting in the Donbass region over the past 8 years. Most obviously, Russian leaders have carefully studied Western strategies and techniques against the former Soviet Union and current Russia. This is a comprehensive strategy, covering all areas, showing Russia's careful preparation and foresight in dealing with international challenges. In the context of deepening globalization, economic policy has become one of the most important strategic tools in forming and directing international relations. With Russia, a series of sophisticated policies have been applied, from preventing Russia's participation in international trade and financial institutions to using trade agreements as a means of bargaining. Restrictions on technology and capital transfer are also set as a card in this strategic game. A good example of the extent of this interference is the EU's demand on Ukraine, forcing it to choose between signing a trade agreement with the EU or with Russia, which became the spark that started it. For the Maidan Revolution of 2014 and the ongoing war today. Politically and socially, the penetration of Western non-governmental organizations, NGOs, into Russian society has brought a new wave of Western values and perspectives. These organizations aim not only to spread values such as individual freedom and LGBT rights, but also to change perceptions of traditional Russian values. These activities face strong opposition from the Russian government and the Orthodox Church, who value the protection of traditional values. Furthermore, these efforts also aim to change Russians' view of Soviet-era historical issues, thereby weakening public support for the current government and emphasizing it is necessary to reshape historical awareness. Thus, the intertwining of economic, political and social strategies has created a complex network of policies and impacts, affecting not only relations between countries but also social and political structures within each of those countries. In the field of diplomacy, Western strategies have aimed at changing the balance of power in Eastern Europe and the countries of the former Soviet Union, luring them away from the orbit of cooperation with Russia to become a member of NATO or accept U.S. military bases. This change is not only the result of a policy of expanding influence but also a response to strategic competition between great powers. In terms of military, support from the West has been evident in many stages, from indirect to direct, from providing money to weapons for forces in countries with armed conflicts. Page with Russia. A prime example is the support for Islamist forces in Afghanistan to fight the Soviet Union from 1979 to 1989, a decade-long effort that reshaped the region's political landscape. In addition, the West also supported rebel forces in Chechnya in 2 wars in 1994 and 2000, as well as supported Georgia in the 2008 Five-Day War against Russia, marking a turning point in relations. Relationship between Russia and the West. Most recently, continued support has been provided to Ukraine, demonstrating a clear pattern of military and strategic policy aimed at encircling and limiting Russian influence in the region. These policies not only reflect geopolitical strategy but also reveal the profound challenges that Russia faces in maintaining its influence in the region, in the context of surrounding countries. Increasingly shifting towards supporting or actively cooperating with NATO and the US. The question is, if they were clearly aware of the West's intentions, when did the Russians prepare for war? under the leadership of President Putin, Russia began preparing for an almost direct confrontation with NATO immediately after the 2008 war with Georgia. In that context, the events in Chechnya and the two wars with Georgia were clear signs that the West did not hesitate to financially support opposition forces, thereby creating conditions for Islamic groups, which they supported in the Afghanistan War from 1979 to 1989. The aim was to keep Russia mired in a civil war. In 2008, the events in Georgia showed that NATO did not simply support but began directly equipping a country capable of waging war against pro-Russian forces in the regions of South Ossetia and Abkhazia. This was around the time that Saakashvili, a pro-Western figure, took power in Georgia and led to the 2008 war. At about the same time, another pro-Western figure, President Yushchenko, came to power in Ukraine in 2004 after social turmoil similar to what happened at Maidan 10 years later. At that time, while serving as prime minister, Putin realized that, sooner or later, NATO would turn Ukraine into another Georgia in its conflict with Russia. These profound insights have prompted Russia to prepare not only militarily but also in foreign policy, to proactively deal with potential challenges from NATO's expansion of influence on its flanks. Western part of Russia. These events are not only military battles but also wars in the field of global strategy and politics. Although the Russians were successful in the 2008 war in Georgia and then President Saakashvili of Georgia was defeated and became a criminal in exile, this war revealed serious limitations in Russian armed forces. The Russian army's victory in this war was mainly due to the courage of soldiers and generals in the North Caucasus Military District, not due to the technical level of logistics. Besides, the victory was also partly due to the small size of the Georgian army. Analysis of this war also shows that, if the West succeeds in separating Ukraine from Russian influence and arming the country, Russia's problems will become extremely serious. When the Soviet Union disintegrated, the Baltics were the main producers of electronic and semiconductor devices installed on Soviet weapons. Meanwhile, Ukraine serves as a center for the production of tanks, armored vehicles, warships, aircraft, missiles, and is a place for research and production of special alloys and engines for the entire industry. Federal weapons. Design studios from tanks to missile aircraft and warships are also mainly located in Ukraine rather than Russia. Therefore, once Ukraine is strongly supported militarily by NATO, its previous dependence on resources and technology from Ukraine will cause Russia to face great difficulties in maintaining and developing its capabilities. Its defense force. This is not only a direct threat to national security but also a major challenge to Russia's technological and military autonomy in the region and the world. Faced with the risk of becoming a country with the largest army and weapons among the countries of the former Soviet Union but lacking a significant defense industry, Russia has had to make continuous efforts. They accepted responsibility for paying off all of the Soviet Union's debts in exchange for receiving back as many heavy weapons as possible, from strategic bombers to warships of the Black Sea Fleet. To ensure this, Russian intelligence had to use measures to provoke the soldiers and officers of the fleet to refuse to swear allegiance to Ukraine, despite the agreed principle that wherever the army is stationed, it will belong to Ukraine. Return to the country where they are stationed, to swear allegiance to Russia. Over the next 10 years, Russia used cheap gas and oil to supply Ukraine, in return receiving steel, engines and spare parts that they could not produce themselves for their heavy weapons. However, in 2004, when Yushchenko came to power in Ukraine, a potential nightmare appeared for Russia. Ukraine would likely cut off all military cooperation with Russia, which would cause Russia's entire navy and air force were hit hard by the lack of spare parts. In addition, if Ukrainian military forces are re-equipped by NATO and become hostile to Russia, the situation will become much more serious. Under the Soviet Union, the Red Army possessed two of the best equipped and trained army groups located in East Germany and Ukraine. While the army group in East Germany directly confronted NATO, the army group in Ukraine was tasked with protecting the most important economic and military center of the Federation. After the agreement between West Germany and the United States was established, the Red Army cluster in East Germany was dissolved, but most of the Red Army forces in Ukraine became the core of the Ukrainian army. This, coupled with Russia's delay in rebuilding its defense industry, from basic materials such as steel and alloys, to sophisticated equipment such as semiconductors and electronics, has created a serious challenge. If Ukraine chooses to follow NATO and Russia is not prepared, this country will become a giant with feet of clay, when its large army is not supported by a strong defense industry. Furthermore, by 2000, the Ukrainian army did not experience the same war damage as Russia's, but merely declined through self-degeneration. Meanwhile, the Russian army has faced serious losses in 2 wars in Chechnya and a short war in Georgia. This not only weakens the Russian armed forces but also affects their fighting ability. Another risk is that Ukraine has the second largest army in Europe, just behind Russia, and its officers are very familiar with the Russian army because before 1991 they were part of the same army. Team. Since 1991, there have not been many changes in the Russian army in terms of science, technology, organization, and strategic tactics. If the Ukrainian army is supported by NATO in weapons, organization, logistics and intelligence, even though Ukraine's economy and population are smaller than Russia's, but with a deep understanding of Russia and technical support, intelligence from the West, the Ukrainian army will become an equal opponent to the Russian army. 31. Kyushenko len nam gwin ta Ukraina. Nuoi na de nan tuk duok en hung thach tuk truok mat va bat dao de en han quatrin zay dung lai nen song engip quoc fong. Tai nin. Tuk te fu fang ve su lak hao qua quan doi na chi tuk su by foi by sao kuok chien voi Georgia veo nam 2008. Du la luk na quiet tom tap trung fat trian song engip quoc fong va tai trang by lai quan doi. Lan Dao Tien Sao Kai Lin Bang Exo Viet Sup Du. Putin. Kai I La Thursday Tuong. De Trian Kai Mot Chuang Trin Hien Dai Hoa Quan Doi Voi Non Sach Kong Lo Dan Cho Nhu Nam Toi. Ku Hoch Nai De Kien Bo Truong Tai Chin Na Doi Diem Du Tu Chuk. Boi Ong Lo Nai Rang No Se Dua Na Veo Tin Trang Fa San Mot Lan Nua. Lap Lai Sai Lam Qua Lin Bang Exo Viet Kai Chi Qua Nhu Cho Quan Su. Funding pro-Russian parties to win elections, and using economic benefits such as cheap gas and oil, and preferential credits. Incentives to maintain influence in Ukraine. Russians understand that even if the Ukrainian government is pro-Western and is trained by NATO, launching a war against Russia is not easy when Russian culture and the Russian language still play a role. Important in people's lives. A typical example is that after the Maidan Revolution, President Borisenko's cabinet tried to use Ukrainian and English to replace Russian but in the end had to accept the use of Russian in meetings because it was the second language. The only language in which all members of the government can communicate without the need for an interpreter. Influence on Ukraine has increased markedly. Russian culture is still respected and Ukraine's history with Russia and the Soviet Union is not violated. Although this bill was not passed, it ignited the fire of separatism in the East, where the vast majority of the population speaks Russian as their first language. This continued to lead to the rise of ultranationalist forces in Ukraine, which had a history of collaborating with Nazi Germany during World War II. Honoring a figure like Stepan Bandera as a national hero not only angered Russians but also sparked conflicts with Poland and other communities affected in the past. As confirmed by Western leaders such as Merkel and Hollande. During the period of rebuilding the defense industry and modernizing the army, Ukraine not only received military support but also changed textbooks, military training activities, and eliminated cultural influence. Russianization. Although it still considers Crimea and the separatist eastern regions part of itself, Ukraine has moved from economic embargo, suspension of pensions, and blocking of water supplies to closer cooperation with NATO and experts. NATO over the past 8 years has trained the Ukrainian army right on Ukrainian soil. This is shown in all aspects from diplomacy to media, where Russia is constantly isolated and painted as a dictatorial, cruel country, a danger to world peace, from the sophisticated to the crude level. Shallow. These intentional arrangements in the bad situation that occurs to Russia, from Trump's election as U.S. president to issues such as rising prices and inflation. This propaganda system has created a fear of Russia similar to the way they created fear of China in international competitions, and works by Russian musicians from before the 20th century cannot be played. Western museums even publicly announced that they would not return works of art they borrowed from Russian museums. The Russians realize that the upcoming war will be a proxy war on Ukrainian soil, and the outcome of that war could be the survival of the Russian Federation. They believe that the West will use Ukraine as a push to push Russia onto the path of collapse like the Soviet Union before it. Confidently about Russia at an international press conference, saying that Putin was wrong to invade Ukraine and annex Crimea. Now, in 2015, Russia is losing what it has worked hard for in the previous 25 years since the collapse of the Soviet Union. The West, more than ever, is united against Russia. Economic sanctions are causing Russia to collapse, and the collapse of the economy is foreseen as the value of the ruble plummets. Embargoes will deny Russia the opportunity to modernize its country. Russia's main source of revenue based on oil and gas is falling dramatically. The lives of Russian people are being terribly affected by Putin's reckless decisions, and the Russian elite at the time Putin did not comment on the matter. What Obama said. Putin evaluated the Russian economy in 2014 in a one-sided way, saying that it was completely dependent on energy exports and that even Russian agriculture could not provide enough food for its people, forcing they have to import using foreign currency earned from selling energy. Them into a revolution that removes Putin from his position of power, just like they did in Ukraine and a number of communist countries. Former Soviet Union. Increased oil production contributed to world oil prices falling from $110 per barrel in 2013 to $43 per barrel in March 2015, and to $28 per barrel in February 2016. Combined with a series of the embargo against Russia and the drop in oil prices have severely affected the Russian government's budget. At this point, the West believes that it is only a matter of time until Russia's foreign exchange reserves are exhausted and Russia will either have to abandon Crimea and the Northeast, or a revolution will occur. In April 2020, oil prices fell to a record low of just $11 a barrel. This is Russia's decisive blow to take down the U.S. shale oil industry, which has continuously suffered losses since 2015. After oil prices dropped to $40 a barrel. By 2020, most U.S. shale oil businesses had to close and go bankrupt. Not only fired first but also destroyed America's most powerful economic weapon aimed at strangling Russia's budget. Russia's victory here is not only retaining budget revenue but also decisively destroying the shale oil industry, a weapon that the U.S. can use to manipulate oil prices. In its endurance and bold strategy in economic war. This global is to be supplied to most countries in Europe. In this field, Russia has no significant competitors in the market. While Merkel and Hollande may have thought they had lulled Putin to sleep with the two Minsk agreements, in reality Putin had lulled them into believing everything that had been signed. This has led to Europe constantly increasing the amount of gas it purchases from Russia, increasing its dependence on supplies from Russia. With Russia, they believe that Russia is completely led by them and is naively providing them with cheap gas. With the amount of gas consumed by Europe constantly increasing, Russia's budget is not affected by the decline in oil prices but is in fact seeing a bumper harvest. Dependence on cheap Russian gas will also cost them later, when the war with Ukraine occurs. It was the destruction of the U.S. shale oil industry and Europe's dependence on cheap Russian gas that caused the U.S. and Europe, when the Ukraine war broke out, to resort to non-market measures such as import bans. Oil imports and gradually moving to ban Russian gas imports. Collapsed. From 2014 to 2022, Western sanctions mainly targeted consumer goods and high-end services such as finance and banking. They believe that due to Russia's weak manufacturing and high-end services, when embargoes these industries, the lives of Russians will be immediately affected. The loss of Western food products such as dairy from the Netherlands, wine from France and high-end electronics will make Russians feel their quality of life has declined. West did not recognize. During 8 years, when the Ukrainian army shelled the 2 separatist republics in the Donbass region, while their children had to hide in cellars, as the president of Ukraine said, Russian industry advanced beyond measure. Step. From a country with a tradition of food imports stretching back to the Soviet era, Russia has become the world's leading exporter of barley, pork and many other products. All of Russia's food is produced domestically, which helped people's lives not be affected when the war with Ukraine broke out, while strengthening the country's food independence. Only when the war in Ukraine broke out and the West imposed strict embargoes did the world realize that famine could occur as soon as 2022 if there is a lack of wheat and fertilizer produced by Russia. Similarly, many other parts of the world will also face a similar situation in the coming years without these supplies from Russia. Stockpiles were full and the need for heating was no longer a concern. They discovered that the Russians had no intention of abandoning their strategic goals and had switched to a war model. Castle. At this time, the problem for Europe is not how to wean itself from Russian gas, but how to wean itself off cheap Russian gas. Energy sources. They realized that there was no cheaper source than Russian gas, both in the short and long term. They also discovered that, although their industries are now losing world markets to China, they are still holding on in Europe thanks to their competitive prices with Chinese products. However, without cheap Russian gas, the costs of all energy-intensive industries will increase to the point where they cannot compete with China, shaking the European economy. In their own right but also because of their role as inputs to many other industries. If these industries go bankrupt or are acquired by China, other industries that are their output will sooner or later suffer the same fate. Which in competition with Europe is like the tiger growing wings. Meanwhile, Europe is like a tiger that not only lacks wings but also loses legs. And Russia's gas price was even higher than the price sold to Europe before the war broke out. This situation creates a paradox. While Ukraine is devastated and its army is depleted by war, Europe has to pay high prices for energy, and that money ends up in the pockets of liquefied gas producers. America, at the same time helping Russia collect more money from China. Which if it happens, it can be joked that their official name will become Soviet Union. Right, North America. These actions of Russia, from using European gas money to reduce oil prices and destroy the U.S. shale oil industry, to using money from the Chinese to destroy European industry, shows a complex and sophisticated multi-layered strategy to ensure national interests in dealing with challenges from the West. Internally, agricultural and industrial development not only helps improve the resistance of the Russian economy but also prepares for war and improves the economic life of the people. To influence political and social life. The Internet system, the channel for spreading anti-government information during the color revolutions, is also strictly controlled. Russia is the first country to deploy and completely disconnect the domestic internet system from the international one. Studies on educating the history of national traditions are also deployed in parallel with propaganda about anti-Russian activities in Ukraine, showing a comprehensive strategy to consolidate Russia's power and influence both in and abroad. Conducted live television reports, publicizing the decision-making process to open the campaign in Ukraine and then the annexation of 4 Ukrainian provinces into Russian territory. Although many people think that this is just Putin's performance, I believe that this is a calculated step on his part, to prevent those in the Russian leadership from turning the flag during or after the process. War. Or later the issue of reviewing the war could be raised and blaming Putin for making an arbitrary decision. This also sent a strong message to the diplomatic front. The Russians realized that Obama was overconfident in assuming that the entire international community would support the United States in the fight against Russia. In that context, Russia has gradually implemented a policy to ensure the separation of any alliance that the US may wish to establish in the future, especially when the war in Ukraine has broken out. For 8 years and refused to implement the agreement. However, what both Europe and Ukraine do not realize is that Russia is gradually preparing for an upcoming war. Prices is about 1,300 billion euros. This number, although huge, only helps those who receive support to endure, not to develop sustainably. And even for a rich country like Germany, continued support like this will quickly exhaust the country. When the EU imposed sanctions on Russia, Russia applied various countermeasures against EU countries. In particular, for the most passionate anti-Russian countries such as Poland, Russia has cut off all energy supplies from gas, oil to electricity as soon as these countries refused to pay according to signed and implemented contracts. Currently embargoed with other countries such as Germany and Central Europe. Method. Not paying directly in Russian currency but transferring euros to a Russian bank, which then changes it to Russian rubles and transfers it to the seller. This action led to inconsistency in the way the embargo was implemented in the early stages, with Hungary being a typical country that only partially enforced the embargo and refused measures that could cause damage to the country. Considered it an illegal and undemocratic act of intimidation. Since then, Hungary has still acted according to its own interests, refusing to provide money and weapons to Ukraine and refusing to implement harmful embargoes against them, and the EU has not taken any measures to punish them. Punish this country. This has caused the new government in some countries after the collapse of the old government with the view of thoroughly punishing Russia to completely reduce its anti-Russian intensity, such as Bulgaria and Italy. Russians always imply that Poland's enthusiasm in helping Ukraine is aimed at retaking the territory of Western Ukraine. Even when Poland recently increased its military by 250,000 troops, Russia hinted that those troops were in preparation for entering and taking over Western Ukraine. That is an area controlled by Kurdish forces, who were previously supported and equipped by the US to fight IS. However, the Kurds have their own dream of establishing an independent state for themselves, including the southern part of Turkey, to control the Kurdish rebel forces. This cooperation has turned Turkey into a pole of power outside the US and Europe in the war between Russia and Ukraine. Turkey also ensures the implementation of the wheat sale agreement between the parties and increasingly becomes a center for Russian gas transportation to southern Europe, replacing Ukraine. Benefits from cooperating with Turkey. This cooperation is not only a way for Russia to maintain influence in the region but also a way to ensure stability for its larger economic and diplomatic strategies. Important role for NATO. The country often receives criticism from Europe for its domestic policies and, despite waiting in line for 20 years, has still not joined the EU. Forces. This not only helps them improve their position vis-a-vis the US and EU, but also helps them in international negotiations. These UAVs, Turkey has stopped supplying them to Ukraine and switched to negotiations with Russia on oil and gas transit. This is completely understandable, because if it continues to provide UAVs, Turkey will lose the reputation of the equipment for which it was widely known during the previous Armenia-Azerbaijan war, when its UAVs were destroyed. Russian troops shot them down en masse. Economy. With this relationship with Russia, Turkey can use its advantage to bargain with the West. The most typical is Turkey's action when voting against Sweden's application to join NATO, showing that Turkey holds important cards in its hands to maximize a national interests in the context of current complex geopolitical situation. People. The US sent condolences to Turkey. However, the reaction from Turkey, through the words of this country's foreign minister, was very clear. Turkey refused to accept condolences, on the grounds that they knew clearly who trained and supported them. Aided the bombers. Saudi Arabia, America's key ally in the Gulf. More independent than the US. The peak of this independence was in the context of the Ukraine war breaking out and world oil and gas prices rising, causing the leaders of the US, France and the UK to go to Saudi Arabia to propose to the country. This helps reduce oil prices by increasing production or providing oil at preferential prices. Reshape their diplomatic and economic links with the United States and other Western powers. This action helped Russia both financially and in terms of strength in maintaining the war. Besides, the war in Ukraine also benefits China in many aspects. In the event of an incident, the US 7th Fleet can easily block these 2 points, and China will be suffocated in terms of energy. Therefore, a land-based, cheap and stable energy source with large volumes is the ideal guarantee for China's long-term development. Russia is an ideal partner in terms of energy supply because China knows that Russia is very aware that it cannot invade or control China and that it will suffer huge losses if China collapses. China's influence and presence in Africa. However, this is another issue that is not discussed here. With a population of 1.5 billion people and the world's #1 economy, China can completely replace Europe in the distant future, if Europe completely cuts off buying Russian gas. The man behind these strategies correctly observed that although China was poor at the time, its participation was indispensable in defeating the Soviet Union. However, at the beginning of the 21st century, Americans went against their own principles of success, when they simultaneously viewed Russia and China as two enemies, causing these two opponents to join hands and form alliances with each other. The West, benefiting from Russia's discounted price and the price increase due to the situation. Market. When criticized for buying Russian oil, India's foreign minister responded to a European journalist that it was time for Europe to stop claiming that all its problems were the world's problems, while all its problems were the world's. Of the rest of the world is irrelevant to them. In another interview, he reminded the West that India has long ceased to be a colonial country and that it will act not in the way the West wants, but in a way that is most beneficial to national interests. Their family took place immediately after the BRICS summit, with the participation of member states including Russia, China, Brazil, India and South Africa. During this meeting, BRICS members did not take any action against or condemn Russia's war in Ukraine. Soon after, two countries, Algeria, Argentina and Iran, applied to join the BRICS bloc. Other countries are also interested in joining, and regularly send representatives to the bloc's meetings, including Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Turkey, Kazakhstan, Nigeria, Senegal, Thailand and United Arab Emirates. This ratio is expected to change further for BRICS, because the population of this group accounts for 41% of the world's population compared to only 17% of the G7 group. This change not only reflects a shift in global economic power but also shows a change in the international political and economic balance, where developing countries are gradually taking on an important role. This highlights the differences between the two blocs in terms of how international trade operates. G7 created the G7+1 mechanism, allowing Russia to participate in the bloc's meetings. However, after receiving threats from the West about removing Russia from the G7+1 bloc, everything seemed meaningless. The current reality is that no one clearly remembers when the G7 removed Russia from the G7+1 group, because that no longer had any impact on current developments. Similarly, the G20 bloc also loses its meaning when its key members are members of both the G7 and BRICS. Countries no longer play the sole role in shaping international political and trade rules. Only economic pole in the world and no longer has the power to force the whole world to follow its embargo decisions. Perhaps they did not realize that the development of BRICS is an important part of Russia's war preparation plan, seriously eroding the West's economic power in the war against Russia. Considering the correlation of forces between the West and Russia, that victory could have led to the collapse of Russia itself. At that time, Western solidarity was very tight and Russia was not prepared to resist a strict embargo. Russia's economy and defense industry at that time were not well prepared. On the international front, Russia has also not created alliances that share common interests with itself, reducing its ability to respond effectively to great challenges. Policy, in which Russia chose a cautious economic approach and patiently prepared for the future. Second, in the same way that Henry Kissinger aligned with China to deal with a common opponent, Russia has joined hands with China, not only as a strategic partner but also as an alliance in politics and economics. Economy to face challenges from the West. China, but also enters the most complex geopolitical regions to build its position. Military intervention in Syria has not only strengthened Russia's geopolitical position but also helped it gain important cards in international negotiations. It's not only hindering NATO and the West's efforts to counter Russia but is also gradually becoming the main source of gas for southern Europe, replacing Ukraine's role. Thereby, Russia not only maintains but also strengthens its influence in Europe. These actions by Russia, in the current geopolitical context, show a complex and far-reaching diplomatic strategy aimed at strengthening its position in the international arena. Russia is also preparing for a regional war with Ukraine by completely changing the global economic landscape. One of the important steps is to establish the BRICS bloc with China and implement agreements to use the local currencies of member countries in the bloc to buy and sell oil and other goods. Economy. By taking a step back, accepting certain economic disadvantages, Russia has made BRICS allies come together to escape the threat of the West and find common interests in fighting against prohibited activities. Fortune of the West. War broke out. Europe thought they could cut off Russia's gas and oil revenues, but they discovered that Russia had not lost that vehicle, because there was a ready replacement from India. India and China realized that they not only faced losing a horse in immediate costs, but also risked losing the long-term car, that is, heavy industry that relies heavily on energy, creating a domino effect when they encounter difficulties. For example, if the fertilizer industry, the main input of agriculture, is affected, it will lead to a decline in agricultural production. The metallurgical industry, which provides materials for light industry, is similar. The electricity industry, which is a basic input for all other industries, if production costs increase will also increase general operating costs for the entire economy. Thus, Europe's inability to find cheap and stable energy sources is not just a temporary challenge but can lead to long-term far-reaching consequences, affecting the entire economic structure of the area. Realize an even bigger risk: the survival of heavy industries that depend on energy. Although they can last through this year, if appropriate solutions are not found, these industries may not be able to sustain in the coming years. And light industry. The electricity industry, which is an essential input for every other industry, if it suffers from rising prices, will also cause widespread negative effects. Without timely measures, Europe will not only lose the horse in the spending balance game this winter, but will also risk losing the horse again. That is, its industries. Leading to a serious decline in production capacity and long-term economic stability of the entire region. Only makes them economically disadvantaged, but also unintentionally benefits China, where 9 out of 10 leading solar panel companies are operating. The end result is that Europe could end up with a government in debt and an industry unable to compete with China. At that time, China's acquisition of their key businesses was no longer a threat but became a reality, causing them to lose their queen on the global economic chessboard. The Russians have been quietly preparing for this war for a long time and have made careful calculations. Understanding this, we will realize that declaring Russia is running out of missiles, as Ukrainian and Western leaders are implying that Russia is about to give up, is completely meaningless. Bank.